What's going on, guys? This is Rob. Okay, so we are here with Action Comics, and Superman's deadliest enemy is coming back. Here's the thing, it's not Doomsday. And I feel like some people are gonna be like, what? No, it's not Doomsday, but it is Superman's deadliest enemy by far. So here's the thing. This initially picks up with a kind of monologue of sorts with Lois Lane, where she's writing to a degree about the nature of the city of Metropolis before and after Superman. And she kind of hits it in two different fronts. Now, this is written by Philip Kennedy Johnson, and it does come off as Warworld Saga. The Warworld Saga is not really required reading, because in this video, I'll basically make sense of the things that you need to know to understand what came out of Warworld to grasp what's going on here. But when she talks about the nature of Metropolis before and after Superman's arrival, the before portion is before he ever even arrived on the scene in the first place. And the second portion, or at least the second aspect of before he came back, is kind of when he was gone during the events of Warworld. And now Superman has effectively returned. So as far as him ever showing up beforehand, she only really hits on it insofar as saying, like, Metropolis was kind of a city like any other, right? You had levels of crime, you had like governmental corruption, different things like that. But Superman showing up on the scene, it wasn't like the emergence of Bruce Wayne's Batman in Gotham City, where he basically started cracking down with a kind of iron fist. That where Batman is somewhat dictatorial, using fear to basically turn the direction or determine what direction Gotham's gonna go in, Superman uses hope. And so by showing up here and kind of being a beacon of sorts and showing humanity a better way, that what it did is it actually led to hope rising in the city, and that people started getting rid of corrupt political leaders. And they started focusing more on building the city of Metropolis into a city that was better for everybody, even if it meant that you had to give a little to get a little, right? You couldn't get 100% of what you wanted, but 90% is good enough, right? Just the betterment of society. And so even when Superman had basically vanished during the events of Warworld Saga, while you still had the House of El, the other members of the Superman family, which we'll talk about here in a second, at the end of the day, it wasn't Superman. And so because it wasn't him, hope was almost kind of lost in the city of Metropolis. But with his return in the midst of like a protest and some crazy stuff going on, that the city sort of regains its hope again. More so than that, again, it's not just Superman who emerges here, it's the whole House of El family. Now, this was Philip Kennedy Johnson kind of building on one of the few things that Brian Michael Bendis got right in his Superman run, because for the most part, he kind of screwed it all up. But one of the cool things that he did is that in DC Comics, you have different versions of Superman in some capacity that exist out there, right? You've got like Superman himself, you've got Jonathan Kent, you have Supergirl, you've got Steel, you have Kenan, right? The Superman of China, who's one of the coolest characters ever in DC Comics. I love him, right? You've got Connor Kent, right? So like the Metropolis Kid is I will always know him, and we'll talk about them a little more over the course of this video. But they were always kind of scattered and dispersed, right? Supergirl was off doing her thing, Connor Kent was on like Young Justice and the Titans, and you had the Superman of China who was kind of out doing his thing. John Henry Irons had more or less kind of walked away from the superhero role after the death and return of Superman. He kind of lingered for a little while, but had been a background character for years and years. One of the things Bendis had done is he had consolidated it all, and he had created the House of El in the sense that not only are they all some variation of Superman in some capacity, or at least a person with Superman type powers, that's what basically brings them together. In the case of like Kara, she's basically the cousin of Superman, so they're connected by blood. Connor Kent is the clone of Superman who was created after Superman was killed at the hands of Doomsday, and then he emerged as the Metropolis Kid and the now famous Don't Call Me Superboy storyline. Right? John Henry Irons, Connor Kent, the Eradicator, Cyborg, they were all kind of like the reign of the Supermen, so different versions of Superman that showed up after the main Superman was killed by Doomsday. But whether or not they're connected by blood or the role they play, they are a kind of family. And so they operate that way, right? They don't go on like crazy adventures together all the time, but it's always one of those, no matter what's going on, one of us will always be available for anybody that needs our help. Now, in the midst of all this pandemonium and these protests and so on, we end up finding Metallo's there. Now, here's the thing. Metallo, to me, is probably the deadliest villain that Superman has. And I know that like hardcore Superman fans and even hardcore DC fans will say, no, that's ridiculous. Doomsday's the one that killed him. And that's a fair argument, right? It's a fair point to say Doomsday is Superman's deadliest villain because he's the one who killed him. But here's the thing, Doomsday's a MacGuffin. Literally, the guy's power is to never die and just grow more powerful all the time. Like, that's literally all he is. He was a plot device that was used to launch a story that basically meant nothing when it was done. With Metallo, this guy is basically a dude who is a walking, talking kryptonite reactor. How do you kill a guy that you can't touch, or at least defeat him, and can't even get all that close to him? Now, initially, that was the way the stories played out, right? Metallo in the Silver Age, Metallo in the Bronze Age, Metallo in the 90s, right? And going into the 2000s. It was always kind of that way. One of the things that happened is that over time, DC kind of evolved Superman to the point that he would do like quick passes at Metallo, right? He'd get in and out really, really fast before the kryptonite could affect him. And then he would also use different suits of armor and things along those lines. But the reason why I say Metallo is the deadliest villain of Superman is because unlike Doomsday, where they just pummel each other, that Superman has to use a combination of his brain and his brawn to overcome Metallo. He has to build some kind of suit for himself or don some kind of a suit. He can't just swoop in and face off against this guy. And so it was a really, really cool moment. I mean, he'll do it in this comic because the story demands it. But under any normal circumstance, it doesn't work that way. The other part of this is that Metallo is effectively planning something. More so than that, he has this kind of mental projection that goes on in his head of Lex Luthor. So seemingly he's working alongside Lex. Now, we'll find out not everything that's happening here is as it appears, but the kind of family dynamic of the House of El comes home when you have like Superman's return to Earth being celebrated, and you have him spending time with the family, and they're all like playing card games and different things like that. It's cool. And honestly, it looks like the most fun ever. But one of the things that Superman does is he brings together the entire family, and he says, before I left for Warworld, Jon asked me a question that I've thought on every day since. He asked why I don't do more. Now, the reality of this is when he says, Jon asked me this question, this was back during the very beginnings of DC Rebirth, right? Like during Frank Thierry and Dan Jurgens' Action Comics Superman run, that when Jonathan was first really kind of brought into the superhero landscape to a degree by Superman, he would ask all these questions that we as the fan base found ourselves asking over the years, but DC just never directly answered. And one of them was exactly this. Why don't you do more? Why are you just a guy that like whisks in and saves somebody or something like that? And so he says, I've always trusted in humanity to find their way. I still do, but it's become clear to me that Earth is in a critical time and that it is time for us to do more. We've seen alien worlds, cultures, and technologies, even alternate futures. Earth needs to see what we've seen. And that's the benefit here, is because in a lot of ways, Superman always sort of kept the crazy spacefaring adventures away from Earth, if for no other reason than the fact that it was a way to keep Earth out of danger of superpowered villains that existed out there. But the other part of that is all the experiences that he gains, the level of technologies that exist out there. Now, he doesn't really intend to like launch this campaign where it's like, we're gonna make Earth more advanced, guys, and Apple's gonna be the one to do it. That's not really what he's talking about here. But what he is saying is very reminiscent of the events that we saw transpire in Silver Surfer Requiem by J. Michael Straczynski. For those of you guys who never read that story, it's a phenomenal story. It's like the death of the Silver Surfer. It was amazing. We'll go back and remaster it because I love that story. But the thing about it is that there comes a point when Peter Parker's Spider-Man ends up encountering the Silver Surfer. And the Surfer, I don't remember if he tells Peter that he's dying or if Peter picks it up, or maybe it's just never spoken. But he tells Peter he'll give him a gift. And so what Peter does is he actually extends the gift to humanity. And he says, show the human race exactly what makes us special and unique. And so for a moment, the Silver Surfer provides humanity with cosmic awareness. They become completely aware of their place within the entirety of the universe. And while we don't necessarily find the full fruition of that, what's basically indicated is that it unites humanity in a way that was never perceived possible before, because they realize how fragile humanity is, but also everything that can be accomplished. And so while of course Superman's not going to grant the entirety of the human race on Earth cosmic awareness, it is one of those things where it's bringing the benefit benefits of his technological experience out in space, the things of Kryptonian technology and so on and so forth, bringing that kind of advancement to humanity. More so than that, what he also does is he introduces Ortho and Orsul Ra. Now, these are two characters that came from the Warworld storyline, and that's the thing. So the whole idea behind Warworld is that it's basically led by Mongol and then essentially his offspring, but Warworld is itself literally a floating planet. It just exists out there. It's a whole world. Now, they do have an actual race of what are kind of like DC Spartans to a degree, albeit more self-interested and less focused on like an organized society, but they're incredibly powerful, and they serve as kind of a police force slash invading army. So what will happen is that Mongol or any one of his descendants will show up to a world, right? His army will descend on that world. They'll destroy anybody who resists, and they'll enslave the rest, strip the planet of its resources, and then those who are enslaved will then become basically gladiatorial people on Warworld. Now, what also happens there, and especially in the case of these two kids, their entire family was killed, but they were too young to truly understand what was going on. So they were quite literally raised on Warworld. And so like so many other people who are either conditioned to do it or who don't know anything else because they were young when they were captured, they came to view Mongol as almost their kind of god. And their goal was to basically achieve his satisfaction, right? To basically say like, we want you to approve of us, and that fighting in the arena and working their way up the ranks was the best way to do it. Now, Superman being stuck on Warworld, because there was red sun radiation, he didn't have any powers. And in fact, there was a point where he could have potentially been rescued, but he shot the option down because what he wanted to do was basically foment insurrection. He wanted to lead the people of Warworld against their governing body, overthrow it, and rebel, which was actually really cool, right? Superman became an insurrectionist. It was kind of amazing. But the thing about this is that it ultimately led to Superman bringing these two kids back to Earth and then adopting them because they're incredibly capable. And in fact, they kind of go by the name the Super Twins at the moment. They're like the most fun ever. They're amazing. Like, I love reading about them, but they're kind of being added to the Superman family in the House of El to a degree. They are young, so they don't necessarily get all the experience and everything that goes along with it. But what ends up happening here is that by way of Metallo's intervention and his actions, when John Henry Irons and his daughter end up basically initiating this grand plan to basically launch Steelworks, which will serve as a kind of technological beacon and will focus on building really advanced technologies that can be used within the city of Metropolis to improve everybody's life, that Metallo makes his move, right? He attacks Steelworks. Now, the idea here, at least according to the vision from Lex Luthor, is that Lex wants Metallo to do it because Lex Luthor wants to be the one to decide what direction Metropolis goes in, right? It's the most basic Lex Luthor plot ever. And that in order to make it happen, Lex Luthor has taken the sister of Metallo and is threatening to kill her if he doesn't do it. That's kind of the crazy thing, but again, not everything's what it appears to be. And so Metallo launches an attack. Now, Connor Kent is the one that spots Metallo, but doesn't initially recognize him. Instead, he goes up to investigate what's going on, and the Metallo blasts him with kryptonite radiation, which is enough to take Connor Kent out. And the Metallo basically starts to destroy the building. Now, of course, Superman and these guys are able to respond, and that's the nature of Superman's evolution over time when he's dealing with Metallo. Because notice this, even though he hears his voice and he doesn't initially know that it's him, once he figures it out, he initially keeps his distance. He doesn't just go running up to Metallo and like attack him. Because as a guy who's basically emitting green kryptonite radiation, Superman can't linger for long. And so that's why you see him staying a kind of little bit of distance away and then figuring out how best to take this guy out and then launching into the attack. Now, the other benefit here, and this is the reason why the House of El is so cool, is because Superman is vulnerable to green kryptonite radiation, Supergirl's vulnerable to it, Connor Kent's vulnerable to it, John Henry Irons and his daughter are not. And so they immediately go on the attack. And so despite how capable Metallo is, and even though he's able to hold his own against these guys, they're able to injure him enough to where Superman can immediately swoop in, freeze this guy up, and toss him into space. And that's it, right? Like, you have to deal with him as fast as humanly possible. Superman cannot let a fight between himself and Metallo drag out, because if it happens, Metallo will overcome him and he will kill him, because he literally is a walking, talking green kryptonite reactor, right? He's literally powered by green kryptonite. It's kind of nuts. And so what happens is that when one of the kids asks who Metallo is, right? This guy who's one of Superman's most capable villains, that John Henry Irons offers a kind of explanation. And the one that we get, I mean, it is good enough to understand the character in the moment, right? If you just want to understand the base nature of him. But he basically says that, like, you know, Metallo was a soldier who volunteered for the Steel Soldier program, a defense program that both Lex Luthor and even John Henry Irons had developed. But he says they rushed it through and there were complications, and that John Corbin's body basically didn't survive. And so in essence, his mind is there, but his body is basically a kind of robot that's powered by green kryptonite, which makes him kind of the ultimate anti-Superman. But one of the things that's cool here is that the two kids really kind of throw in the idea that he sounds like an unmade. Now, before the events of Philip Kennedy Johnson's Warworld, this is a concept that never would have crossed our mind before. But the unmade are basically undead cyborgs, right? People who have, by all standards of measurement, been killed. But using a combination of necromancy and technology, the forces of Warworld can bring them back from the dead, but in like a cybernetic body. And then they just kind of go forward as henchmen of Mongol. And so this almost perfectly describes the nature of Metallo, which really gives me cause to believe that, like, what Philip Kennedy Johnson is doing is kind of elevating the role that Metallo traditionally has, changing up the nature of his character. Instead of him just kind of being a dude out there that emits green kryptonite and like fights Superman and wins sometimes, I guess, that instead he's actually changing the nature of him and evolving him into something else. Now, this all comes home to roost when Superman and the family are all just kind of sitting around after the kids are put to bed, and they're pondering everything going on with Metallo. And what Superman says is that there was a moment in the fight when Metallo seemed to be speaking to Luthor. But one of the things that Superman had done is that in the moment, he had used his X-ray vision to see what Luthor was doing. And Luthor's in jail. He's been in jail for quite some time. That maybe he potentially had a hand in Metallo's escape, but it seems highly unlikely. And so whoever it is that Metallo is talking to, it's not Lex Luthor. And that's why the idea of the Unmade seems more and more prominent, because the nature of the Unmade is, yes, they're incredibly powerful. Yes, they are, for the most part, every bit as capable as Superman traditionally is, depending on what level of power he has in the story that's being written, but they follow orders. They do what they're told. And so someone out there is telling them what to do. Seemingly, someone is telling Metallo what to do. And that where Lex Luthor had almost kind of given Metallo the instruction, destroy Steelworks and like you have to defeat Superman or something like that, as he's out there in space, suddenly the vision of his sister pops up. And it's almost a carrot on a stick, right? Where he's like, hey, you know, I destroyed Steelworks. Lex Luthor's gonna free you now. She's like, well, I mean, it's not that simple anymore. See, like when you defeated Superman, Superman took me prisoner. Right? So now he's got me held in a prison somewhere. So the only way to free me is you have to kill Superman, right? It's like, we'll do this and then everything will be okay. And then once that thing is done, well, no, we have to do this now, right? So whoever it is that's controlling him always kind of has him running like a gerbil on a hamster wheel, right? Like it's always never, ever good enough. He's gonna have to keep finding a way to destroy Superman in order to free his sister, which most likely is not even being held captured or anything in any capacity. So that's when they kind of look at this and they're like, there's something much bigger going on here. Who's pulling the strings? And who is it that's trying to like destroy us and destroy Steelworks and even kill me as Superman? Most likely it's somebody from Warworld. And so what ends up happening is Metallo travels back to Earth and then snatches up some Blue Earth protesters. Now, the Blue Earth protesters are one part, I wouldn't really call them like nature or environmental protesters. They're more like people who are like, Earth is for humans and no one else, that kind of a thing. So like shunning Superman, like we don't want aliens here or anything like that. They've operated by different names in DC Comics over the years, but the general concept of a group out there protesting the presence of Superman, that's been going on for decades, right? Like ever since, I would argue, the Mort Weisinger years in DC Comics in the 1950s, back when he was editing everything, right? Kurt Swan and all those guys. So the thing about this is that Metallo showing up here basically tells these guys, okay, so like as Blue Earth protesters, you guys obviously hate Superman, but let's really put some skin in the game, right? Like right now you're standing on a street corner with signs. Let's see what metal you really have. are you willing to put up or shut up? Are you gonna put your money where your mouth is? So he's like, I'm gonna take you guys and I'm gonna turn you into exactly what you wanna be. You hate Superman so much, I'm gonna give you the power to destroy him. Now, what ends up going on here is when he takes these guys, snatches them up, and brings them back to his base of operations, well, then we see what metal they really have, and they don't have much, right? They're just kind of like, well, I mean, no. All we want to do is protest. You know, we don't actually want to do anything, right? They're like Twitter users and Reddit users, right? Like, they don't actually want to do anything. They just want to look like they're doing something. And so what ends up happening here is he just forces them into it anyway. What he says is he's basically going to strip them down and he's going to turn them, right, eradicate them in their current form and turn them into basically unmade. People like him. He's building his own anti-Superman army, which is amazing. I gotta tell you guys, this is the most interesting Metallo has ever been. And it's not even just this guy that DC's doing it with. They're doing it with Metamorpho, they're doing it with Amazo. They're taking like all these villains that have historically been maybe like B-list or potentially C-list villains, as underrated as a lot of them are, and they're elevating them up to insane levels. Because I'm gonna tell you guys right now, in Batman Superman World's Finest, which we will cover, Metamorpho, well, kind of technically it's Ultramorpho, that guy just demolished Batman and Superman, and not even by a little bit, like crushed them. It was crazy. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.